I'm Emily Rutledge. I'm head of the economics discipline here at the Open University, and I'm also an applied economist focusing on the Gulf Cooperation Council states. So it's a great pleasure to introduce today our guest speaker, Professor Adam Hanieh. Adam is currently Professor of Political Economy and Global Development at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies, University of Exeter, and Joint Chair in Middle East Studies at the Institute of International and Area Studies, Tsinghua University, Beijing. In February 2026, Adam will be moving to SOAS, the University of London, to take up his new role as Director of the SOAS Middle East Institute. He's also a research fellow at the Transnational Institute and sits on the board of directors of the Middle East Research and Information Project. Adam is the author of 4 books, including Money Markets and Monarchies, Cambridge University Press, which won the 2019 British International Studies Association International Political Economy Group Book Prize. His most recent book, Crude Capitalism, Oil, Corporate Power, and the Making of the World Market, came out with Verso Books in 2024 and was co-winner of the 2025 Best Book by an international scholar, global and transnational section of the American Sociological Association. Today, Adam is going to be presenting his talk titled Greening the Gulf, Renewables, Fossil Capitalism, and the East-East Axis of World Energy. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to our guest speaker. Welcome, Adam.
Okay. Yes, thanks very much, Emily and the school for inviting me, and everyone for joining us on a cold Friday afternoon. As Emily said, I want to speak today to this question of the Gulf states, in particular Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, but the other Gulf monarchies in the Middle East, looking at their place in the global energy system and some of the changes that have occurred in the energy system over the last couple of decades, and particularly to take up this question of the renewable or so-called green transition, which we are seeing in the Gulf. And I want to, I guess, the underlying question of this presentation is going to be whether this is a paradox, this kind of shift to renewables and a green transition and its connection to the oil-based economies that the Gulf has long been the center of. So what I'm going to do, I want to try to cover 3 main points. I'm going to begin with just some comments around the place of oil in global capitalism, drawing upon the book that Emily mentioned, Crude Capitalism, and how we can think about this theoretically, and then come to the place of the Middle East, especially the Gulf oil exporters, in the global oil economy and what has been happening over the last period, and then finally focus on this question of the energy transition or renewables and the green transition in the Gulf. So to begin with this question of oil, what I try to do in this book is to work against what I think is a prevailing commodity determinism in the way that oil is often thought about. I feel if you read some of the classic accounts of the history of oil, such as Daniel Jurgens' The Prize, and also some of the kind of prevailing theoretical ways that oil is discussed as a curse, for example, or the Rentier state literature that is really prevalent in the case of the Gulf, these kinds of frameworks invest oil with an agency, if you like, as if oil does something. It's the underlying force. It has an underlying innate power. And what I try to argue in this book is that the problem with this, drawing upon Marx, is it's a kind of commodity fetishism. Oil is divorced here from capitalist social relations. It's divorced from the kind of society that we live in. So the book tries to argue that we need to foreground this question of capitalism, the various logics of capitalism, and think about what does oil actually do what does capitalism actually do in terms of giving oil this apparent power? So things such as this endless accumulation that underlies capitalist social logics, the speeding up of consumption, production, mechanization, thinking about the ways that oil's physical qualities really intersects with these underlying logics. And I think by doing so, we can then understand what does this mean for moving beyond fossil fuels, which so urgently needed in the current context. So that's one side at a theoretical level. But the bigger picture here is to try to trace this historically through the 20th century and the kind of emergence of the world market through those early years from the early 1900s up to the current moment, and in particular the connection of this to US dominance from the post-war period, middle of the 20th century, the rise of the United States as the leading capitalist power. So it's talking about the ways that the emergence of the US dominance is connected to this transition in the world system, also is connected to this transition of oil as the leading principal fossil fuel around the middle of the 20th century. Part of this, and this is something that I think is really important to emphasize, is that we need to think about oil not just in the form of a liquid fuel, but think about how it circulates through our lives, how it's transformed into other useful products. In particular, petrochemicals features very prominently in the story. And here I'm talking about things like plastics and synthetic fertilizers, synthetic rubber. Again, this was a transition in the nature of material production that occurred around the middle of the 20th century, and very much, I think, goes a long way to both explaining oil's deep embeddedness in our economies and our lives, but also the bigger questions of climate struggles and its connection to plastics. Food systems, finance, the emergence of the American dollar, all of these features of the world system are deeply connected to oil, as I try to show in this book. And then finally, the other underlying argument is by approaching oil in this way, we can see it tells us something about energy transitions under capitalism. Again, I'm not the first to make this point. It's I think, becoming more and more clear that energy under capitalism tends to be an additive process rather than a process of replacement. So when we talk about the coal to oil transition, it wasn't the replacement of coal by oil, but actually oil added upon on coal. And in fact, last year, we can see that the consumption of oil, gas, and coal were at record levels. So I'll show a graph later where I think it very clearly illustrates this question of thinking about transitions as additive, not replacements. So that's kind of, I'm happy to speak more in detail about some of these broader questions, but I want to now zoom in a little bit on the question of the Gulf states and their place in the global oil economy. So here, as I mentioned, I'm talking about these states you can see highlighted in green. These are the most prominent of these is Saudi Arabia in the center of the picture there. But there are 6 Gulf monarchies that I want to focus upon: Saudi, UAE, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait. These 6 states are the world's largest exporters of oil and gas, actually, collectively, and really emerged as major components of the global oil industry around the middle of the 20th century, as in the wake of World War II, when Europe made this so-called coal to oil transition. It was oil exports from the Gulf that really underlie Western Europe transition, the rise of oil in Western Europe, and then more broadly in the latter part of the 20th century, the global shift to oil as the leading fossil fuel. Now, understanding these states, it's very important, I think, to think about a couple of features, social features. The first thing is that they are all monarchies. They're headed by ruling families, hereditary rule. These are narrow, it's a narrow social layer. But very importantly, the other striking feature of these 6 states is the nature of the working class composition in these countries, where you see the majority of the labor force, more than 50% of the labor force in each of these states, actually made up of temporary migrant workers who have no feasible route towards becoming citizens or any kind of permanent resident in these states. There is nowhere else in the world where you have such a high proportion of temporary migrant labor in these states. And this is something that distinguishes these monarchies from other neighboring oil producers like Iraq and Iran, that you can also see on the map here, where you have you have long-standing labor movements, left-wing movements based upon very much oil workers and militant trade unions historically. In the Gulf monarchies, in contrast, all trade union activity is banned. The fact that these, if migrant workers who are concentrated in sectors like construction, in retail, and basically all activity, if any kind of labor protests, any kind of strike movements, they can and have simply legally be deported. And this is something which I think is part of understanding the specificity of these states. So it means in places like the UAE or Qatar, for example, you have a tiny proportion, less than 10%, of the population who actually hold citizenship. So this kind of feature of the class structure of these states is very important, I think. Now, as I said, these states were critical to the shift towards oil globally from the middle of the 20th century. Through the early part of the early 1900s and into the immediate post-war period, oil production in these states was controlled by the large Western American and European firms, which we know of as the Seven Sisters, those large 7 Western oil multinationals that basically dominated global oil up until the 1960s and 1970s, and are the forerunners of the big Western firms we know today, like ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, Shell, and so forth. But in the 1960s and in particular through the 1970s, oil production in these states was nationalized, and we see now large national oil companies, or NOCs, as the key producers of hydrocarbon, both oil and gas, in all of these states. And this question of the national oil companies, I want to come back to later, because it's very important, I think, to thinking about questions of climate strategy and the challenges of the climate emergency today. So historically, these states, most of their oil exports went to Europe and to the United States. However, concurrent with the rise of China as the major center of global manufacturing and the rise of the kind of industrial turn that took place in China over the last 2 decades, we have seen a massive increase in the level of Chinese oil consumption. You can see this on this table here, which show the share of world crude oil imports from different countries and regions. You can see in 2000, about 50% of the world's oil imports went to the US and Europe. Today, that's dropped significantly, and China's share has increased fivefold to about 1/5 of the world's oil imports. Now, this increase in Chinese oil consumption is not a zero-sum game. It's not like oil shifted from one place to the other. It was associated with an overall increase in global oil consumption, about equivalent to a new US entering the world oil market. So this process over the last 2 decades has seen globally a significant increase in oil consumption, but China grabbing a much larger share of the global oil trade. And this is what I have described as an east-east hydrocarbon axis, because most of China's oil imports, and similarly with gas, are coming from the Middle East. So there has been an eastward shift in the Gulf states in the oil trade, away from the west towards the east. About 60%, I'll show more detailed figures in a second, of China's oil imports come from the region, and the vast majority of the Gulf's oil exports go now to China. Similarly with gas. Now, this boom in Chinese oil imports, this eastward shift, has been associated with the rise of national oil companies in the Gulf, in particular Saudi Aramco, which today is by far the largest oil company in the world. Its profits last year exceeded the combined profits of the big five Western oil companies: ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, Shell, and Total Energies. Those Western companies, their cumulative profits or combined profits were exceeded by Saudi Aramco. And the other very, very important shift associated with this is the vertical integration of these NOCs. They are no longer simply exporters of crude oil, but they've moved down the value chain to involvement in refining, petrochemical production. The world's second biggest synthetic rubber producer, for instance, today is Saudi-owned. It's actually a subsidiary of Saudi Aramco. They also own shipping fleets, marketing networks globally. So in this sense, these national oil companies based in the Gulf have followed the path of the Western oil industry through the early 20th century, where you see this vertically integrated structure controlling all moments of the value chain, from extraction through to the sale to the final consumer. Now, this is part of how those Western firms I mentioned earlier, the Seven Sisters, were able to exert their global dominance, and the similar process that we see unfolding in the Gulf today, the rise of vertically integrated national oil companies, I think is significant to understanding the power of these NOCs in the global industry. So just to unpack these figures in a little bit more detail around China, we can see here the share of Chinese oil. I should say China is itself a major oil producer, so these figures also need to be put in the context of China's own oil production, domestic oil production, which I think stands, last I looked, at around 7th or 8th in the world. You can see that China, despite that domestic production, still is heavily reliant upon imports. the majority of which come from the Gulf states and the Middle East more broadly. So what this has meant, and this kind of conclusion I think is very important, is that there's an increasing interdependency between the energy industry in the Gulf states and China and the wider East Asia region, not simply in the export of oil. It's not just the fact that the Gulf exports its crude oil to China. It also involves the refining processes and petrochemical industries, where we can see, if you unpack the trends in more detail, deep joint ownership structures linking China and the Gulf. The largest investors, foreign investors in China's petrochemical industry, come from the region, headed by Saudi Aramco. You can see in China petrol stations now branded under Aramco. You see Saudi Aramco advertising in basketball matches in China. So these kinds of vertically integrated structures and joint investment and ownership structures linking the Gulf, China, and the wider East Asia, in particular South Korea and Japan, are very evident. So again, these interdependencies, I think, are important to understanding how the industry has changed in the Gulf beyond simply export of crude oil and gas. Now, just to show this question of refining, this again, I think, is quite striking. This is the share of global refining capacity, which in early 2000s was again concentrated primarily in North America and Europe. But today we can see more than a quarter of refining capacity is now in East Asia, particularly in China. And the only other region in the world where we see this production or this refining capacity increasing is in the Middle East, especially in the Gulf. So you can see, and probably today, if we updated those figures, we would see the Middle East actually exceeding Europe in terms of global refining capacity. So this is again indication of this kind of vertically integrated shift in the Gulf's oil industry, where refining, some of the world's biggest refineries are now under construction in the Gulf, both for fuel, but also petrochemicals is very evident. So this is, I think, pretty. It's clear that we see the changes in the industry, the emergence of oil. I do want to emphasize that I'm not saying here that those big Western firms and the US oil industry are no longer significant. Obviously they are, but I do think we can see, and the US is the largest oil producer globally, following the shale and fracking shift. But I think we can see a kind of fragmented world market where there tends to be an oil industry. The North American oil production tends to be concentrated in the Americas, in particular US, Canada. And on the other side, we see this East-East hydrocarbon axis emerging, connecting the Gulf states and China, East Asia. Now, what does this mean for fossil fuel production more generally, and the state of hydrocarbons globally? The sad fact is, and I would put it more strongly, the catastrophic fact is that there is no intention by the Gulf states to move away from oil and gas production. In fact, all of the projections by these national oil companies and by the Gulf states is accelerating production of hydrocarbons. Back in 2021, the Saudi oil energy minister put it very bluntly. He said, every molecule of hydrocarbon will come out. So there is no intention to move away from this production. Since that time, we have seen all of the Gulf monarchies pledging to increase oil and gas. The question of LNG is important here too, because that's really in Saudi Arabia, and Qatar already has a very large share of the global LNG production, but the other Gulf states are also looking at ramping up LNG capacity over the next few years. Most of this connected to, again, an expectation of increasing imports, China, East Asia, and also India over the coming period. So there is no intention to move away from these hydrocarbon production. Obviously, these are the kinds of figures you see on this screen are pledges backed by investment. So they're not speculative, they're not pie in the sky, they're actually backed by actual investment into oil exploration, refining, and export channels. So this is one side. I'll come back to kind of the political implications of this a bit later. But that's one, I think, very clear fact. However, and here I'll come to this paradox I mentioned earlier, we also see the Gulf states pledging to increase their renewable expansion, particularly solar and wind capacity. So in this table here, you can see kind of the net zero targets and pledges for emission reductions and the share of renewable energy. In Saudi Arabia, for instance, the aim is to have half of electricity produced by renewables by 2030. This is at a rate that is faster than some European states. And again, this is not simply speculative, it's backed by actual expansion of solar and wind in the Gulf states. And you can see in that final column there a significant increase compared to 2018 in total solar and wind capacity across the region, across these Gulf states. Now, this is really pushed the Gulf into the center of the Middle East's renewable sector. In fact, outside of China, the Middle East is actually was last year the fastest growing renewable had the fastest growing renewable capacity in the world outside of China, and the major reason for that is because of this expansion in the Gulf. So it's quite striking. You look at some of the big projects underway around solar and wind, and also batteries, that you can see the Gulf is expanding in this kind of way. Now, the question obviously arises, and here is there a paradox? Why is there a contradiction between this expansion of renewables in the Gulf and the pledge and intent to increase and accelerate oil and gas production? And the simple answer to that is no. There is no contradiction here. In fact, they work alongside one another, and they are explicitly conceived in policy terms as being mutually supportive. Now, how and why is that the case? Well, the first part to this is understanding the nature of electricity in the Gulf states. And again, we can see a very large growth in electricity generation in the Gulf over the last 10 years or so. This is partly to do with this question I raised earlier about the expansion, the downstream and vertical integration of the oil industry, the expansion of refining, which has obviously increased demand for electricity. It is also connected to the very clear effects of climate change in the Gulf states, the need for air conditioning when you regularly reach temperatures greater than 50 degrees in places like Kuwait and elsewhere. So this has meant that as in a global proportion, the Gulf states actually are part of the largest air conditioning per capita in the world, I think. But you see this growth in electricity fundamentally being met up till now by gas and oil, burning gas and oil. So up till now, the majority of the electricity production, the vast majority, from the burning of these conventional hydrocarbons. Now, what the Gulf states are trying to do with this expansion of renewables is, in the words of the Saudi oil minister, expressed as a triple win. When asked about this expansion of renewables in the region, he said a year or two ago that there were three wins that Saudi Arabia expected from this expansion of renewable. Firstly, they hoped to cheapen the cost of electricity through solar and wind, and because of this expected continuing growth in electricity consumption, that's the first win. The second win, and this is really the key point, is that by doing so, by shifting a greater proportion of electricity generation towards renewables, they would be able to expand the volume of oil and gas that could be freed up for export. So the aim being here to actually free up more hydrocarbons to export rather than burning it for consumption at home. So here we see very clearly the ways in which the oil and gas expansion works alongside and is reinforced through this renewable capacity, expansion of renewables. And then the third win, according to the Saudi oil minister, was to be able to meet their climate targets, to be able to brandish their green credentials on the world stage, and basically say, look, we are not dinosaurs that are holding up the fossil fuel transition. We are meeting our climate targets responsibly. And you can see this in ways that are connected, I think, to the increasing presence of these states and the national oil companies in global climate negotiations. And I'll come back to this at the end. So there is no contradiction, in other words, between the expansion of renewables. And then I should say the other aspect that's important here is the question of AI and data centers, which are also looking at expanding their presence in the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So just to sum up and finish with some final concluding remarks, if we look at this expansion, the picture here is of what at the time was the largest single-site solar farm in the world in the UAE. Owned by Masdar, which is a UAE renewable energy firm, which is chaired by the head of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, which also, I think, says something quite striking. But this expansion is taking place across the Gulf. It is conceptualized in this term of the triple win that I spoke about. It depends very much upon the use of the kind of migrant labor that I spoke about. The actual expansion of renewables is a lot cheaper because of this highly exploited migrant workforce available in the region. It has a very deep linkage with the oil industry itself. If you look at the ownership of these renewable projects in the Gulf, many of them are controlled and owned by national oil companies and other oil-related and gas-related firms like Aramco. So again, the actual linkages with the oil industries are quite explicit. And we also see, very interestingly, this east-east connections that I spoke about also evident in the renewable sector. So this picture of the Masdar site is a jointly owned project with a Chinese solar firm, and it's not simply the provision of cheap solar panels from China. It's actually Chinese involvement in the production of electricity and ownership of the project itself. So we can, I think, speak of a broader energy access, east-east energy access across the Gulf states, where you do see this heavy involvement of Chinese and also South Korean and Japanese investments in this sector. In fact, in the case of Saudi Arabia, the largest integrated battery site is currently under construction in Saudi Arabia, and it's a joint project between the Saudi state and BYD, the big EV car company in China. The other aspect to this, which I think is significant, is that if we look at the wider Middle East region, it is Gulf-based firms that are leading the drive, the rollout of kind of renewable energy in other parts of the Middle East and North Africa, in places like Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Tunisia. It's actually Gulf-based firms that are owning and rolling out these schemes. So if we're thinking about how the energy sector in the region is transforming, it is very much connected to the Gulf, as well as the oil industry in the Gulf. So this kind of expansion is not simply the Middle East, it's also true of the wider African continent, as well as Central Asia. Many of the big schemes are undertaken by Gulf-based firms, particularly Saudi and UAE firms. I mentioned this question of climate policy and climate financing, and the role of the Gulf states in this. And I think this is a very important question that needs to be better tackled by the climate movement, because we can see in the COP process, for example, COP28, of course, was held in Dubai. It was run by Sultan Al Jaber, who is the head of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, and also the head of Masdar, the UAE firm, renewable firm I mentioned. So it's clear the ways in which the Gulf states are playing an outsized role in the making of global climate policy. And we saw this in the most recent COP in Brazil, where the Saudi state played a major role in blocking language around moving away from oil. Now, I think this is important to think about in more depth, because the national oil companies are very much on the same page as the big Western oil firms like ExxonMobil in terms of how they think about the expansion of the oil industry and trying to block any effective climate policy. But there is a difference in the ways that these national oil companies operate, in the sense that because they are state-owned, predominantly state-owned, their owners, if you like, are in the room when climate policy is being made and developed. They actually have a vote and a say in the development of this global policy. COP is a very clear example of this. We know that there were many fossil fuel lobbyists present in Brazil, but the fact that the Saudi government is actually voting on these things and is able to block and change the language around this stuff is evident. It's evident also not just in the COP framework, but also in, for example, the Global Plastics Treaty that was has been under negotiation for the last few years. At Busan in South Korea, there was last year the possibility of the idea being to limit the production of plastics globally through this treaty. Again, Saudi Aramco, or the Saudi government, played a major role in preventing that from happening and shifting the debate around plastics towards, more recycling and rather than any limits on the production of plastics. So in all these ways, I think we can say the NOCs and these Gulf states are really, playing a major role in obstructing any kind of effective policy making, as well as pushing what I think is fairly clear, our false solutions to the climate emergency, such as carbon capture and hydrogen. Again, looking at these schemes, some of the largest projects are actually underway in the Gulf, led again by these oil firms. So the last thing I want to say, and I'll end here, I've mentioned the kind of the role, but I do want to come back to this point around energy transitions as additive, not replacement. And I think this graph really does show this quite clearly, where we can see the expansion of energy has come through layering of different kinds of energy source, but not their replacement. Oil, gas, and coal really leading and expanding. And I think despite the expansion also of renewables, it's not in contradiction to this. So I'll leave this here and look forward to any questions and discussion expanding on these points. Thank you.